It's March 29, 2018, and Dr. Han from Cool Terra traveled here from California last night. He's due here soon. We're going to dissect all these cylinders that were established back January 26th of 2016. So we've kept these things alive and growing for 26 months, and just kept irrigating them with filtered water, carbon filtered water with reverse osmosis, so there's no chlorine. There's a few times they got irrigated with chlorine by accidents with the tap water, but most of the time we try to keep it with non-chlorinated water, and we have not fertilized them either. So these are really just trying to grow and maintain themselves with all the pre-plant amendments. So you can see here, hopefully on the different labels of all the different inputs here. Root Shield, for example, is a Trichoderma heraseum. WSM is a slew of different mycorrhizae. Witch's Brew is basically what we did to our putting greens, which is all of it, vermi extract with biochar, backpacks, a whole slew of different organisms. EcoGarden, Rhapsody are two types of different bacilluses. So it's going to be fascinating when we pull these things apart and see what we witness under the ground, so to speak. But I wanted to kind of document really clearly the differences here visually on top. Rhapsody's a little off color, kind of thin compared to the EcoGarden. Soil Success. Sanctuary has got some fertilizer in there with a bunch of bios. That's looking really pretty good. Root Shield, okay. The mycorrhizae, you can see the grass here is better with as far as color goes, and a little denser. By the way, these are all seeded the same with the same rate, same bent grass. Witch's Brew is looking really good. Vermi extract's looking pretty good. Here's our peat control unlabeled. Here's our backpack. Soil Life, another probiotic. Biomega looks really, really good. Another series of controls. The 5% biochar with vermicompost. 5% biochar with biosolids, always is a good one. Biochar 5% with 10% vermicompost. 5% of the Miramichi, which is the biochar compost combination, compost and swine manure. Here's biochar preconditioned with Root Shield, Soil Success, and Terraplex. That's kind of our Witch's Brew. Not too different than this one. You can see that's looking really good. Here's 10% biochar preconditioned with vermi extract. Here is the biochar preconditioned with Biomega and Terraplex and Miracle Grow at 10%. Here's 10% biochar alone. Here's biochar with 10% biosolids, another one that creates a lot of surface biomass. And here's another one, anaerobically digested cow manure from Dairy Farm. That's really a good looking amendment too. And here's 10% Miramichi, again with the 50-50 composted swine manure with biochar. Anything that says biochar is Cool Terra's material. The Miramichi is a different type of biochar. The biochar from Cool Terra is a coconut hull parent material, and Miramichi uses southern pine as its biochar material. So hopefully that gives you a good general view of what we got going on here. We're going to tear these apart a little later today when Dr. Han gets here. Here's another. So this is the Witch's Brew. This is a little bit of everything. Pea gravel, completely held together. 4 inches of pea gravel. With beautiful roots. So roots clearly all the way down the pea gravel. Mat, little thatch. All right, it's March 29th, 2018. Han, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, my name is Han Kim. I'm a principal scientist at Cool Planet Energy Systems. I'm responsible for investigating how our material, Coolterra, affects plant and plant microbial interactions.
Wonderful. Mike?
I'm Mike Emmerich. I'm a tech rep with Cool Planet.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So what we did here, we have roughly a 2-year-old study going on here in our greenhouse, a little over 2 years, where we have the cylinder tests, where we used various soil amendments, one being an industry standard peat. Most of the rest of these have some element of char in them, not all, but biochar was our main interest, and how we can possibly perhaps precondition the biochar to deliver certain biology perhaps at a more successful, higher level. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. As we took these cylinders apart, you can see they had 4 inches of pea gravel, for example, 12 inches of mix to represent a profile similar to a USGA type root zone that you'd use on a putting green. So this is kind of laid them all out. They're all still labeled. And Han, if you can kind of go through these a little bit and just see it from your technical view, what you see that is interesting and perhaps different just visually.
You can't really see unless we do more in-depth microbial analysis, but visually you can see mainly between, this is just the compost or microbial inoculant without the biochar, and this is just the biochar alone. And you can see that compared to those treatments with the biochar and the compost and or microbial inoculants, they don't do as well. There's not as much of a root biomass or development of fine root hairs, whereas the treatments with the biochar and the compost and the microbial inoculants, you do see greater root biomass or fine hair root development. For example, this is the witch's brew, right?
Mm-hmm. The witch's brew.
Or the backpack, where you mix biochar with several different microbial inoculants or extracts, compost extracts, right? Okay. So you can see very nice development of the fine root hairs.
So the witch's brew, just so we understand that a little better, basically we took all these soil inoculants and mixed them together to call it our witch's brew, right. Where some of these we're really trying to study better what they are, what value they may hold individually, like backpack is a type of strain of bacillus, for example. So that's included as part of the witch's brew.
Right.
So when we extracted it, it was interesting how even the root system in some of these were so aggressive that they held on to the 4 inches of pea gravel.
Right.
Look at that. That's just amazing. Where others, maybe not so much. I mean, we were pretty aggressive getting these out of the cylinders.
So this is, for example, this is 5% biochar with 10% vermicompost. You can see compared to just biochar there, a good comparison would be this and that, the biochar, 10% biochar, and the compost or microbial inoculant alone, and the 5% biochar and the 10% vermicompost. You can see that the biochar with the compost has a synergistic effect than the biochar or just the compost alone.
No, so there was also a significant difference on the biomass as far as leaf tissue goes, right? Where we at first we maintained these with some trimming, and then we quit trimming them several months ago actually now. So you can see, for example, this one's the biochar and the biosolids, right? 5% biochar, 10% biosolids. You can just see what the nutrient impact did to the top growth. So compare that to, let's say,
just a 5% biochar, or
this one here looks pretty lean. So this one here at 10% biochar preconditioned with vermi extract. So you can see not nearly as much green leaf tissue, but still had a fair amount of root mass, and the thatch layer is not as significant either. So the way the plant grows in these different mediums is significantly different, I guess, based on nutrient and microbial activity. I want to note too, this is 2 years growing in these cylinders without any post-fertilization. So in fairness, with the straight biochar, that material never really got much in the way of any satisfaction with nutrients, right? So that's probably starving the system, if anything, because nothing has been offered at post-seeding as far as fertilizer goes. We just kept watering them with filtered water, non-chlorinated water, and so we really wanted to see what these pre-plant amendments had to offer long-term. So the fairness with the straight biochar, that doesn't really represent what you would typically do, perhaps.
But you could also say that just without the biochar, this is a compost. It has more nutrients than the biochar alone,
Yep,
right?
you're right.
But it doesn't do as well as if you have the biochar and the compost.
Correct.
Such as some
Right.
of these treatments, right?
Yep.
So even if the compost provides some nutrients, it doesn't have a greater benefit than just the biochar alone. It seems
So
like,
it's the
right?
three legs of the stool, right?
Right.
So you have the physical component, the chemical component, and the biological component.
Right.
And some of these are weak in one area and stronger in other areas, and you want to bring all those strengths together as one, right?
Right.
But we've been waiting for this time for quite some time. It's just interesting to see. It's been a long time that these have been growing these cylinders, and when we pulled them out, I mean, they hold together like basically a sausage link. The other thing we're really trying to focus in on is the mat and how these different amendments impact how the plant itself grows and what kind of mat develops near the surface. The thatch, you can see like this one here created quite a bit of thatch. That's soil life. I forgot, that's a kind of a group of different organisms. And the mat, we call it the pinch test. You can kind of feel how it's much firmer for a period of time, and then it gets really soft. Mm-hmm. So that's a mat, and this is the thatch. So we also want to kind of understand that dynamic, because in a sand-based root zone, over time, that's what creates some level of dysfunction if that organic matter and mat gets too pronounced. Here you can see the peat, how it grew. Lighter color, obviously, just being peat, but much more mat. That mat's all the way down to here. Far more mat. Thatch, not significantly different, but the mat, feel that? Just keep pinching, and you'll see how it all of a sudden it'll start collapsing underneath it. And that differs. Like this one here has very little mat. This one has a little more mat than that. So this was a replicated trial, but we extracted these cylinders earlier in the process. This is going to end this trial now, and Coolterra was kind enough to come out here and visit us and help us extract this, and going to take some material back with them and do some DNA analysis on this, right?
Right.
And try to get a better idea, I guess, scientifically or technically about what organisms are persisting with these various inoculants, whether they're very specific, strain-specific, like Rhapsody is a certain bacillus, or whether it's a whole slew of them, or whether it's a shotgun approach where you have extract or compost that has organisms that we don't even know the names of for some of them. Is there anything else you want to say or comment on?
I think once we look at the what microbes are present or absent in, depending on the treatments, that'll give us a better idea of what our material or biochar has on the microbial population.
Wonderful. This is the split cylinder test we did. So what we did is we backfilled these cylinders with 4 inches of pea gravel, or kind of resemble a USGA profile. And then we made this plastic divider, and it slides in here real tight. And we backfilled one half with 8515 sphagnum peat, and the other half with our vermicompost mixed with biochar from Coolterra. And so we mixed the Coolterra char with our vermicompost 50-50, and then we blended that at 10% by volume with the 90% USGA sand. So they both had the same sands. One has 15% peat, sphagnum peat. The other has 10% of that 50-50 biosolids. Biochar plus the vermi. And what we did is we took a plug out from our greens, a tiny little sampler plug. It's about the size, a little smaller than my little finger here, and carefully centered the plug in the center of these cylinders. So half of the plug would be basically where the peat is, and the other half would be where the biochar vermicompost is. Oh, by the way, we removed this plastic part after we packed it down, so there's no barrier there. So the whole idea was to see what happens under the surface. In other words, which side do the roots prefer, and how did they grow in each half of this cylinder. So we extracted one. We'll go take a look at it. That was a lot like this one. This one here is a little stunted because I put this one under drought stress. I let this one wilt and then rehydrated it. I just wanted to see what the difference would be. If there would be more root loss perhaps on one side versus the other. And so we're just kind of playing around with it and see what we witness.
I can see though, actually. This is...
There, now I can see it. Definitely. This is the cleaner side. That's the darker side.
Right. You can see particles on here.
Yeah, okay, hold on.
Give it the back.
So the left side is the side that was growing in the 85-15 peat, and the right side is where the root zone was amended with the biochar vermicompost. We put together this poster to be displayed during the International Biochar Conference last year, and I just wanted to show this graphic that we put together. We learned something I think fairly significant in our 20-year-old USGA research green that houses the NTEP trials, as well as 20 different root zone amendments. It's a 7,000 square foot putting green built to USGA recommended standards with 4 inches of pea gravel, a 12-inch mix, no choker layer. What we came to find out is that over time with sand top dressing, you develop another layer, meaning the top dressing thatch horizon, as we try to demonstrate in this drawing here. And this develops over time with sand top dressing. In this case, over 20 years, it ended up being a 4-inch layer. So the 4-inch cap over the original 12-inch root zone mix, what we found is significantly different. So we tried to graph these differences here where you can hopefully see the numbers here. Basically, as a general overview, one of those root zone cells started out as the straight sand. They all had the same sand. So the straight sand did, it started with no organic matter, and it did accumulate roughly 0.25%, which is 0.26 organic matter based on the loss of ignition at 360. And then the root zone cells that had peat lost a significant amount of that organic matter. So, for example, the orange line is the sphagnum peat, started as an 85-15 sphagnum peat mix, started out at 1%, and over 20 years it dropped down to a little better than 0.5%. So we lost about half. The Dakota Reed sedge was a little better in the sense it was a little more stable. It started out at just under 1% and ended up netting out at 0.72%. So we lost about 23% of organic matter. The best one was the compost amended plot, where it only lost 19%. Since that organic material already went through a composting phase, it already went through a cycling process. The peat, on the other hand, generally is found in more or less anaerobic conditions in a bog-like environment, and the lack of oxygen has slowed that process of degradation. So once you harvest it and expose it in a root zone mix, some of those organic compounds become, you lose them through degrading. So as an energy source. So that's what happens with the rootzone mix. The original rootzone mix over time actually leans out. Now that's the 12-inch mix. Then you go on top where the 4-inch cap is, that is built through sand top dressing. Obviously that's the orange line. Obviously there's nothing the first year because there's no layer there yet. And then over that 20-year period, as that 4-inch layer builds, it ended up being at 2% organic matter. So in very simple terms, what I'm, I guess, getting at is that that top dressing horizon is at least twice as much more organic matter than the rootzone mix, at best. And that creates a lot of dysfunction in the sense that the water and air movement changes, the pH changes, the moisture content changes. So those dynamics basically creates another horizon, another layer. So these sand-based systems, rootzones, like the California green or the USGA green, I feel sand top dressing is somewhat problematic in those situations. Push-up type rootzone, I don't think you can maybe top dress enough, but it's a significantly different situation where you have more fines and organic matter generally down below that you start with, and you cap it with a sandier mix. That scenario is what you would want to end up with. When you have cleaner sand down below and more organic matter and possibly even finer sands than your top dressing up above, then what I call the rootzone turning upside down occurs, where the moisture ends up being perched at the top, doesn't even get down, the nutrients gets trapped with that basically biofilter near the surface. So let's go in the greenhouse here and I'll show you another piece of thatch that kind of shows you what I'm talking about. But what I wanted to point out here is that what we call the pinch test. Out in the field, so far we've seen this really hold true most of the time. And what you do is you kind of squeeze from the surface down, and it's firm, 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 and then all of a sudden it starts to collapse. And you can see that here. You can go take a soil sampler out to a putting green, for example, and take a core out, and you'll feel that. And wherever it starts to collapse is pretty close. It's just usually just below the original seed bed if it's an older green. So a turf system obviously is going to deposit organic matter. Like we said, down here it ends up being fairly little, in the sense of about 0.25%. In our case, was deposited over 20 years. So 0.25% is not that great. But up here it's a different situation. Far more dense, more lignin, more cellulose, because these are the plant parts that are more robust. The stems, the stolons, the crowns, and without any top dressing, a mat will develop. But as well as some thatch. But the problem with sand top dressing is, the way I see it anyways, is that this will only develop to a certain extent, and we've seen differences in plant genetics to what extent that will develop, and these different amendments in biologicals. So these phytohormones that develop through microbial activity combined with nutrients, combined with plant genetics, actually drives some of these characteristics on shoot to root ratio, carbon allocation, and complexity. So what I'm getting at is that if you have a mat layer, which we need for resilience and whatnot, we need some mat there on a putting green. And but when you continue to sand top dress, you're burying all this material, and most of that is preserved. So over time, you can see this mat here. Hopefully you can kind of see how it pinches down really tight here. And then right here, this is your mat layer basically. Over time, as you continue to top dress, this layer grows in depth. And as it grows in depth, eventually it gets to the point where, in our case, 20 years time, it's 4 inches. Now you're getting close to outer reach with many of your cultural practices. Your conventional air fires get down to only about that deep. Your slight venting doesn't even generally get that deep. I mean, it can, but with those longer spikes, there's more interference with ball roll. So it becomes more and more problematic over time. And then what happens is this big mat of organic matter that's probably close to 2%, this is probably close to 0.25%. Now you start creating a lot of dysfunction where most of the moisture gets trapped, doesn't even have a chance to get down very well, nutrients get trapped, pH gets altered, and all kinds of things can happen. Black layer, the iron precipitating out, or calcium. We've seen that already. We're going to go show you some photos and a video that we saw out in an old golf green. And ultimately what ends up happening is this beautiful root mass that you experience the first few years in a new sand-based green shrinks. And then almost all your action ends up in this top dressing horizon. And that's what we're trying to better understand and what we can do to better manage that. And I'm under the belief that one saying is the solution to pollution is dilution. So if organic matter is the pollution, the idea is to dilute it with sand, which is true. It does occur. This organic layer at the surface, you commingle that with sand, fresh sand top dressing, and that will help reduce the organic matter in that upper surface. But what happens is over time, like I mentioned, that organic layer deepens with the sand and the organic matter continues to be deposited. So I think over time, as this mat layer deepens in depth, you're actually increasing organic matter in a sand-based root zone. So if the solution to dilution is pollution, you have to somehow live with that. What I'm going to manage my new greens are with the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. So we studied this with plant genetics. So part of the reasoning I picked the plants that we did, the bent grass, was based on the organic matter that it sloughed off, the CN ratio that they had, and then that's trying to reduce the organic matter. The amendments that we used also helped to help the plant grow in a way that has actually less of this biomass. And through light verticutting basically every week, very often, the idea is then to remove this. So we remove the biomass instead of burying it, and then we kick up some of the sand at the same time if the growing conditions are favorable for it, and then we recycle the existing sand. So we never really build this layer significantly in depth like you do when you sand top dress. This is one of our research greens here. This is the 20-year-old green that host the NTEP trial, the on-site NTEP trial here that was sponsored by the NTEP, GCSAA, and the USGA. So we're fortunate to have this. Tom Voigt oversaw this part of it, but basically the green was built with the NTEP trial, and then the other half of the 7,000 square foot green has the rootzone mix study. So this was seeded with a 50-50 blend of L93 and Providence. And here's the list of the different amendments, organic and inorganic amendments. You have things like the straights. This is all the same sand, by the way, USGA sand, but there's one plot in there with the straight sand, and then one with an 8515, and the other one with a 9010 Dakota reed sedge. So these are kind of the industry standards. And it goes on with various amendments with like chip humate, profile, Zia Pro, Axis, Optimal, biosolids, compost, worm castings. So there's a whole slew of them, 20 of them. And what I want to show here is we pulled a plug from the straight sand block where you can see the color difference easier than the others because it started with no organic matter. And what we found was the root zones that have organic matter in already leans out. You lose part of it like I talked about in the video, but it gets capped with basically a biofilter with the sand top dressing mixed with the plant's own organic matter. So what you end up with, in our case, in 20 years, a little over 4 inches of material that is significantly different than the material that the green was built out of. And if this differential is great enough, dysfunction occurs with air and water movement, and then when that happens, you know, all kinds of things can happen, from black layer to iron precipitate. But what I wanted to show you was the color difference, and then we're going to do the pinch test. So first of all, you can see we got this soil sample taken almost to the pea gravel. I could hit it, but it got slightly compressed. But that's this entire sample, straight sand. And then we're going to do the pinch test now, where you just gently pinch, and you'll feel how firm. Oops, starting to get softer, but still firm. Now she falls apart. It's just firm, 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 and then it falls apart. And that is basically the original ridge zone, or the original seed bed rather, was about here, 12 inches down. So there's 12 inches up from the top. And you can see, hopefully in the video, that's where the color changes too. So there's a little bit of a mat that occurs just below the seed bed, but then the majority of what's built up is from sand top dressing and bearing the plant-derived organic matter, creating a layer that's not only twice as much more in organic matter than the original mix, but also often a finer sand, because these high dense putting surfaces now are only receptive to the finer sands. So even if you put a coarse sand on, trying to match what this was built out of, maybe you can see the slight aggregation here is a little coarser than here. Even if you try to match this sand, it's still, you have a hard time getting it in there. So you have a mixed match of sand often, and then you have high organic matter almost all the time, and that creates what I call the bi-layered ridge zone. So you have 4 inches of pea gravel here creating one layer with a perched water table, and then you create a second layer by sand top dressing. Okay, something I just wanted to review briefly here is some of Glenn Obear's work that speaks to the iron cemented layers, or the iron precipitate, that he is studying and doing a great job figuring out what's going on. So I just want to focus on this Midwest green that's 35 years old, 27-inch precipitation, but it's 35-year-old green, growing Poanian bent, and there's an image here that shows that ridge zone that looks very familiar. It's very similar to our image of our 20-year-old green, where you have this top dressing layer that's developed through sand top dressing that commingles with the plant-derived organic matter that drives this bi-layered ridge zone. It's very clear. So you have a pea gravel creating a perched water table and one layer, and then over time you create another layer. And these layers, depending on precipitation and cultural practices and etc., this layer can become highly dysfunctional and create iron precipitate here, black layer issues. But at the best scenario, what ends up happening is this capping of the original mix ends up having higher CEC, as we talked about, higher water holding capacity, and most of your roots end up in this layer right here and very little down here, which, you know, part of the reason we built these wonderful greens is to ensure we get good deep roots so we can afford to dry this surface out and maintain firmness and high level of functionality. So go and look to the data here. It's interesting where you can see it through the organic matter testing. This is the inches in depth from the surface, 1.8, 1.9, 1.9, and then it drops down to 0.8, and then it drops down probably to the original mix, 0.4, 0.4, 0.3. So I'm going to say this is probably this is where the transition zone was on this green. So if you were to take this in 1 inch increments, my guess is maybe at the 4 inch layer, 4 to 5, it'd probably be closer to this number. And then somewhere you're going to meet that seed bed, the original seed bed, or just below it.
Oh, that's where it feels like.
Yeah, so here we got a green that has been irrigated for a while, an abandoned golf course. You see all these little green patches of bent, surviving, thinking it was good plant genetics. But what we found was everywhere there was a green surviving patch of bent, there was a chunk of peat. Here, take a sample outside of the green. There's a chunk of peat down here from poor blending of when they built these USGA greens, keeping the turf alive. Over here now, you can see where the turf is dead, there's no patch of peat. There's a little iron precipitate out just below the layer, by the way. That's the seedbed layer. That's that thatch horizon. Do you see that? But no peat. Take one more sample. Let's see if we can get that iron. No, out here where the iron precipitate is. So that iron precipitate is occurring just below that matte thatch horizon, right? You can see it right here. And if it gets bad enough, this is where it gets toxic. So this is probably where the seedbed is, and this is probably where, do the pinch method. Vitas, do the pinch method. You pinch, firm, firm, firm. Where does it change?
Losing it just above.
Then it gains again. What's that like? Is that firm?
Oh, it's gone.
So the iron precipitate is just below the matte layer where you pinch it, where it's firm. And you can see there's that distinct layer. That's all dry, good clean sand there. But just amazing the impacts of having this little clump of peat has. Here, we'll do this again. There'll be peat in there.
Yep, I felt it.
Did you feel it? There it is,
Yep,
right there.
it is.
Pretty far down, but far enough for the roots to. And look at the iron precipitate just above that. So anywhere this water movement has interfered with a layer, whether it's this upper layer or this layer of peat, the iron precipitate's showing up. And the only reason why this little patch of bent is surviving this drought is because of this chunk of peat down below, where the roots are still getting what it needs to maintain plant function. Just absolutely fascinating.